Thank very much. I would like, first of all, to thank for Dr. Stevens and Nathan for these very precious opportunity. Um, so, first of all, please allow me to introduce myself. I'm Associate Professor of Rhetoric from China's Fujian Normal University, and also a PhD candidate in Argumentation Studies here at the University of Windsor. I'm sorry, I did not prepare a PPT. So I just present some basic ideas in this paper. First of all, I would like to tell what is my argument, what to argue in this paper. So I would argue, in this paper, I would argue that the principle of duality is always contingent upon spatial and temporal conditions aimed at the specific audience with a particular purpose, which means that to make an interpretation charitable inevitably entails its subjectivity rather than objectivity. The principle of duality always originates from somewhere. An inhabitant place replete with physical and non-physical factors, such as religious belief, political stems, cultural values, and personal experience. So this is basically what to argue in this paper and why. And then I would like to say a few words about why this topic. So I think my basic stance is that stylistic consideration has not garnered attention from scholars specializing in the field of the principle of duality. And I think it is important because stylistic argumentative style impacts, influence the way your audience receives an argument, how to interpret it, why interpret it in this way rather than in that way. So, so this is, I will talk about the latest two categorizations made by Professor Franz van Imbelen. One dimension is the detached style, and the other dimension is the engaged style. Maybe it's a little bit unfair for my commentator, Loris, because in the original paper sent out about almost 2 weeks ago, I actually, and I have not talked about this. So I will be addressing the in-between area between the detached style and the engaged style. So I would argue that it's very difficult in many cases to differentiate the argumentative style from the engaged style. So sometimes somebody like he or she is delivering in the engaged style, but actually he or she is to try to detach himself or herself from the issue. So, and sometimes maybe you find a detached style, but actually it is engagement par excellence. So I would argue that it's very difficult to, to differentiate the detached style and from the engaged style. So this is why we think what a theoretical framework I'm approaching this topic. And a second point in the for my theoretical framework is the rhetorical notion of sprezzatura. Sprezzatura is a very old notion in rhetorical studies. So basically, my interpretation is that it means self-effacement or self-concealment. And so this is basically the two most important points in my theoretical framework in this paper. So what, why, and now how? So I will say, I will talk a lot about how stylistic consideration is important for the principle of triality for scholars specializing in this field. So I will depart, the point of departure is the rhetorical style of neutrality. So we need to think about whether it is possible for a neutral or objective interpretation of the interlocutor's argument, right? So, my approach is pretty different from the approach taken by Dr. Fabio this morning, and also Professor Gabe Godil. And I don't know whether I understand these two famous scholars correctly. They both are sort of agree, sort of hold that objective interpretation is possible. And, or we can say neutral, an area between subjectivity on the one extreme and objectivity on the other extremes. So we can dig out an in-between area, which I call the neutrality of interpretation or objectivity of interpretation. I'm strongly in disagreement on this point with Professor Fabio and Professor Godil. So I will use, in my case study, I will use the China-United States communication on the Ukrainian issue, on the Ukrainian-Russian war as my case study. So the gist of the case study is to show that the rhetorical style of neutrality really influence the argumentative interlocutor, or the audience reception, and interpretation of the very argument presented for the other side's assent. So, okay, and finally, so this is how, why, what, why, how, and I would like to say a few words. Now, what's the demand? What's the rhetorical style of neutrality? What is this style demanding of the interpreter? So my stance is that the interpreter, an arguer can strategically maneuver in a pragmatic dialectical term. An arguer can sort of manage to strategically maneuver the way your audience will receive your argument, will receive your message. But there is no way that an arguer can determine how your audience, how your argumentative interlocutor will receive your message. That's impossible. So as I will show in my case study, it's a OPED published by Washington Post shortly after the breakout of the Ukrainian-Russian war on March 15, 2022, by the then Chinese ambassador to the United States. The title is Where We Stand on Ukraine. So I will show 2 points in the case study. One is that it's really difficult to tell the detached style from the engaged, what is called engaged style. It's difficult to tell. There is an in-between, I think it's in-between area. It's impossible to strategically maneuver with. The other point is that the Western audience, or specifically readers, the readership of the Washington Post, simply when they come across the tone, the gesture, the language used by the Chinese ambassador in that Washington Post OPED, they will make a decision. Because the way the Chinese ambassador is delivering the message will leave the order an impression that, well, this is the ethos of the institution. They talk in this way. So there is no need for they to go through the OPED article carefully. Simply, they can make a decision by the way the message is delivered in that OPED. So, I mean, the meaning of a text, in many cases, is not a negotiation between the reader and the text. And Stanley Fish and another scholar talk about it in the early 1980s. American rhetorician Stanley Fish. So the way the message is delivered by the Chinese ambassadors determines how the reader will receive the central argument of that newspaper by the Chinese ambassador. So, the stylistic principle of neutrality. So specifically in my paper, the rhetorical style of neutrality demands the interpreter. You can strategically maneuver, but you cannot decide how your audience will receive your message. So I'm more pessimistic than Dr. Fabio and Professor Gaudill in envisioning for a kind of objective interpretation or neutral interpretation of your interlocutor's argument. And I know Dr. Fabio talks about, he developed the notion of stick bending by French philosopher Louis Althusser. So like you hold up a stick, you can either bend it to the right way or either you can bend it to the straight way. The interpreter, the central task is to straighten it. And Professor Gaudill's idea is that, well, accuracy and respect are fundamental in the principle of neutrality. So I sort of read that they are of the opinion that objective interpretation is impossible. So in the introduction of my paper, I will try to create an opening for this project. At the very heart of the principle of neutrality is the act of interpretation. The central problem is how to interpret, or more specifically, the morality of interpretation continues to be central concern for the principle of charity between two ends: charitable reading as a virtue versus uncharitable reading as a vice. Scholars like Scott Aiken, John Casey, Thorson, Stevens have talked a lot about the principle of the morality of interpretation. This means that the principle of charity concerns more the interpreter than the reader. So this is something I would like to argue for a paradigmatic shift for the studies of the principle of charity in my paper. We have been too focused on the interpreter's dimension. Less attention has been paid to the reader response. So my paper is trying. So that's why I think stylistic considerations really matter in this respect. Traditionally, the principle of charity is defined as the principle that we should adopt a charitable interpretation of other people's claims. In other words, whenever we find someone's meaning unclear, we should attempt to interpret it in a way that makes sense. But questions still remain, such as what counts as charitable interpretation? What is exactly charitable interpretation? Charitable for whom? Charitable in what context? For whom an interpretation makes sense? And why it makes sense? Within what context? And for what purpose? I'm happy to hear the interactive communication between Michael Bontrop and Professor Gabe Godil about the Professor Godil also said his accuracy and respect are always context dependent. I'm very happy to hear that. So in this paper, I would argue that the principle of charity is always contingent upon spatial and temporal conditions aimed at a specific audience with a particular purpose, which means that to make an interpretation charitable inevitably entails its subjectivity rather than objectivity. What governs the principle of charity is always the hidden value-laden and interest-driven motives. In other words, the act of interpretation moves in an in-between area of subjectivity and objectivity. It is precisely here that comes the central issue I would address in this paper. Is there a place called neutrality between the extremes of subjectivity and objectivity? And this points to the hitherto unspoken field of stylistic studies. Stylistic considerations that are not of ornamental nature, but do not just refer to the presentational devices to communicate the argument per se, but are correlated with the argument to make the two inseparable from each other. Specifically, I will focus on the rhetorical style of neutrality as the stylistic principle of charity, which is related to the central issue defined in the above. Therefore, I would like to define the current status of the study of principle charity between subjectivity and objectivity. Broadly speaking, the current studies of principle of charity in argumentation can be generalized into three different approaches. The intentional approach that focuses on the moral responsibility involved in acts of interpreting or uncovering the proponent's explicit or implicit intention in arguing, such as works by Rob Johnson, Adler, Govier, Stevens. Neutrality as a virtue in acts of interpreting, such as anthematic parsimony. And the second one is the affective approach. Assuming that the audience experience is the source of meaning in interpreting the proponent's argument. Okay, a lot of work by Douglas Walton, Chris Reed, and Christopher Tyndale. And the third one is the procedural approach that focuses on the dialectical justice or injustice in arguing. In the first two approaches, scholars of argumentation seems to be moving between the two extremes of complete intentionality and complete effectivity, easily sliding into the strawman fallacy on both ends, such as the different versions of strawmanning by Stock Aitken and John Casey, and the victimization of the target audience, as has been pointed out by Katerina Stevens in her 2022 paper. In the three approaches outlined above, the focus seems to be on the argument per se, the process, the intention of an arguer or reception of an audience, and the procedural justice or injustice. Not so much attention as it deserves, however, has been paid to stylistic consideration in the interpretation of argumentative discourse, not at least treated separately as a distinct category or subfield of research. But as I pointed out just now, in recent years, the collective efforts made by pragmatic dialecticians in argumentative style has filled the gap. So as I pointed out now, so in this paper, one crucial point for me is to address the clear distinction between what is called the detached style and the engaged style. So as I pointed out, I will use the Chinese ambassador's Washington Post ED to illustrate why I think it's very difficult to tell the detached style from the engaged style as principles of stylistic principles of neutrality in argumentation. So I will say a little bit about my case study to the Western audience. China's standpoint over Russia's war on Ukraine is assumed to be supportive of the Russian side. To put aside the above-mentioned radical view that China is complicit in the war, they are the seemingly legitimate standing point that, one, if the strategy of economic sanction does not work as expected, then it's China's fault. Because when the West closes the door to Russia, China simultaneously opens a window for it. And second, China is supportive of Russia both economically and militarily. And third, China's behavior will do more harm than good to its national status and national image on the global stage. And four, China risks lowering its own moral standard by allying with a pariah country. Naturally, when the ambassador mentions China as a staunch champion of justice, the institutional ethos of China will certainly be called into question by at least some of the Western audience. So it's precisely here why I think stylistic considerations as principles of neutrality is important. So when the Chinese ambassador defines his own country as a staunch champion of justice, the way the message is delivered strongly put his Western audience in a very adversarial environment. How the readers of the Washington Post will receive the very definition of the target country as a staunch champion of justice. So we need to consider about this. So it's really important. I mean, the way right now the way China reach out to the outside world really matters. The way I just so so in the case study I will try to define the triangular relationship between style, ethos, and interpretation from the perspective of rhetorical style of neutrality, try to illustrate why it is difficult to tell the detached style from the engaged style. Is it a strategy, a rhetorical strategy of self-effacement or self-concealment? Because rhetoric only functions when its artificiality is hidden. Let's go back 2,000 years ago to Aristotle's work on rhetoric. So my conclusion is that cases such as Ambassador Tim's article could not be taken as its face value. Our analysis and evaluation have shown that we could create new concepts and tools, however limited their interpreted power might be, to make present or expose something hidden in the argument, both in its intrinsic and extrinsic dimensions. Broader context, culture, and political are needed to make visible the hidden agenda in an argument per se, and the concomitant argumentative exchanges. So I think I would like to invite scholars specializing in the field of the principle of neutrality to think about the pragmatic shift in the studies of principle of neutrality. So I'm sorry if you feel puzzled, and so what this guy is talking about. So I'm sorry about that. I thank you so much for your attention. Now I'd like to pass the floor back to Nathan. Thank you.
Thank you, Jianfeng. We turn it over now to Loris Isapatini from the University of Windsor for his commentary. Go ahead,
Hello.
Loris.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you, and nice to see you again, Jianfeng. Good afternoon, everyone. I truly appreciate being here. I'm an opera singer and all but defended at the University of Windsor. I'll be commenting on the paper, and let's get straight to it. The case study on Xi-Biden readouts sets the stage. On the one hand, you've got China's commanding tone, imperatives like must and should, projecting strength and authority. Conversely, you've got the US with a much softer, more diplomatic tone. These are deliberate strategies, folks, not just words on a page. They reveal cultural priorities and influence how these nations are perceived. This paper, folks, is tackling something that's been ignored for too long: argumentation style. Most people talk about fairness, about logic, about following the rules. And sure, those things are fine. But what really lands with people? What really moves the needle? Tone, strategy, how you say it, not just what you say. That's where the real power lies. And Jianfeng's work puts that front and center. The paper connects big ideas from pragma dialectics, reader response theory, and rhetorical traditions, It's ambitious, trying to pull these threads together into a cohesive argument. And the case study on Qi Biden readouts is a strong example of how style matters in high-stakes communications. China's imperative, commanding tone sends a clear signal of strength. It's not just a choice, it's a strategy. On the flip side, the US's softer, more diplomatic tone, it's careful, respectful, and measured. You can see how these choices reflect each country's priorities. And let's not overlook neutrality. Jianfeng introduces sprezzatura, neutrality as a rhetorical strategy, not just an objective state. It's clever, no doubt, and makes you think about how so-called impartiality can be a tactic. It's a new way of looking at something we thought we understood. But here's the thing. While these strengths stand out, they're just scratching the surface. And this is where the real opportunity lies. There's untapped potential here, and the work must go deeper to hit its mark. If we're going to talk about the style as a game changer in argumentation, the framework has to be sharper, the terms more precise, and the analysis more expansive. First, the framework needs more clarity. Jianfeng introduced style as a key factor, but how does it fit into or challenge existing theories like pragma dialectics? Pragma dialectics has clear categories: detached versus engaged styles. Detached is all about being neutral and objective. Engaged is passionate, emotional, and connected. So where does this new idea land? Does it expand on these categories? Does it break them apart? Right now, it's not clear enough. If you're going to challenge the rules, you've got to be specific about what's changing and why. Then there are the terms neutrality and self-concealment. These terms are interesting, but feel vague. Neutrality, for example, isn't just a passive state, as Jianfeng notes. It can be a calculated move, a way to look objective while steering the argument. But this idea must be hammered home. Define it clearly, give examples, and show how it works in practice. And self-concealment, it sounds intriguing, but how is it different from rhetorical ethos, which has been around forever? What's new here? If you're introducing a term, it has to be sharp and accessible, not something that leaves people guessing. Now, the case study, the Qi Biden readouts, it's great, but it feels underdeveloped. The Chinese readouts use an imperative tone, with phrases like must and should, projecting authority and strength. But what works well domestically? It reassures their audience that their leaders are in control. But internationally, that same tone risks being seen as aggressive, even domineering. This is a missed opportunity to dig deeper into how that tone impacts global perception. How do international audiences, especially Western ones, interpret this kind of language? Conversely, the US readouts are soft and careful, avoiding direct commands. They're diplomatic, sure, but this comes across as respectful or weak. That's the kind of analysis this paper needs more of. How do these contrasting tones play out in the media? What's the public reaction? Back when Reagan gave his evil empire speech, it wasn't just what he said. It was the way he said it that framed the entire Cold War narrative. This case study could do the same kind of heavy lifting if it went deeper into the ripple effects of these stylistic choices. But here's the real opportunity. This framework doesn't need to stop at geopolitics. Think bigger. Corporate boardrooms, for example. Style can make or break negotiations. A CEO who's too aggressive risks alienating their team, while one who's too soft loses authority. Or think about social movements. Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" wasn't just a speech, it was a performance. The cadence, the rhythm, the style, that's what made it iconic. These examples show that the framework has universal applications, but that's not emphasized enough here. The paper also needs to be more directly with China's strategic use of tone. The Chinese government's deliberate use of imperatives isn't just a linguistic quirk, it's a tactic. It says, we're strong, we're decisive, and we're in charge. But here's the catch. It doesn't land the same way with everyone. Jianfeng touches on this, but it needs more depth. What are the long-term effects of this strategy? Does it alienate allies or solidify their positions at home? The US approach, by contrast, avoids these kind of directness entirely. But does their softer tone risk looking passive? These are critical questions that the paper only skims over. And let's talk about accessibility. This paper is dense, and that's the problem. Great ideas don't matter if people can't engage with them. Simplify the language where possible. Use more stories and real-world examples. People don't remember abstract ideas or concepts, rather. They remember moments. Reagan's "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall" wasn't a policy statement, but a style moment that defined an era. Finally, give readers something practical. Imagine a section titled "Using Stylistic, Charity, and Everyday Life." This would take the paper from being purely academic to something people can actually use. That's how you create impact, by giving people tools that they can apply in real-world situations. Let me make this loud and clear. Style matters, folks. It's not just the cherry on top, it's the whole cake. This paper points to something we've overlooked for far too long. Arguments aren't just about facts and logic, they're about tone, strategy, and delivery. That's what we're here for. It's about how you win hearts, influence minds, and, let's be honest, how you convey ideas in a global sense. Jianfeng challenges us to rethink neutrality and objectivity, and he's right. Neutrality is not always neutral. It's a move, a strategy, a way to influence while pretending not to. And tone, that's where the real power is. It's the difference between being heard and being forgotten. Reagan didn't just say, "Tear down this wall." He owned the moment. He made it unforgettable. That's the power of style. But let me be clear, this is just the start. The big question is, where do we take this? Imagine applying these insights to education, corporate boardrooms, and public policy, as I mentioned before. A CEO who knows how to tailor their tone wins the deal. A teacher who masters delivery inspires the next generation. And in diplomacy, a single misstep in style can shape history. This framework has huge potential, folks, but needs to go further, dig deeper, and get sharper. So here's the challenge. Let's not stop at theory. Let's push this work to be practical, to be actionable. Style isn't just part of the game, it is the game. And understanding that isn't just important, it's essential. Let's think big, act boldly, and keep this conversation alive as we move forward. Because at the end of the day, the principle of charity isn't just about fairness or logic. It's about interpretation, connection, and persuasion. Style shapes how arguments are received. And if we want to understand and advance the principle of charity truly, we must embrace the power of how we deliver it. Thank you.